Hi, and welcome to the video tutorials for MessageManager. I wanted to give you a simple overview of how MessageManager works. MessageManager works on the idea that you set up any number of sprite text objects to be used as message displays. These displays are registered with an instance of MessageManager which will listen for the incoming message, route them to the appropriate message display them, and then finally fade them off based on the settings that you've made for each display in MessageManager. In this pre-created project, I have 7 message displays, both in the UI layer and within the game world itself, including one in a scroll list and one being moved as the child of a rotating cube. These displays are just simple game objects with sprite text or label components attached. You can get this component by going to the Component menu, Easy GUI, Controls, Label. It's up to the developer to set the properties on the sprite text objects so they display properly for their game. MessageManager simply takes your registered sprite text object and feeds it the messages to display. This becomes a little more complicated when using a UI scroll list. The scroll list ultimately does use a sprite text object, but the message text must be set through a UI list item container using its .text property. Using this .text property is handled internally within MessageManager, but the developer needs to set up the scroll list container, and all their parameters. Displays are controlled through the MessageManager script. Each display is registered with the MessageManager and the Message Displays array. There can be any number of these displays. Each slot in the Message Displays array holds the parameters for a single message display. We will talk about how to set up all these parameters later, as this is just an overview to understand how all the elements work together. To send a message to any one of these displays, only one line of code is needed within the game script to call the message method from MessageManager. Let's take a look at a test script I set up that could send messages to a display. You need a reference to MessageManager to be able to send messages. A reference can be accessed through the static function instance. You can simply send messages with MessageManager.instance.message. But I prefer to cache a reference to MessageManager at start. It's a personal choice, but I find the code easier to read and simpler to write when using a cached reference. Let's look at a method I've called sendMessages. SendMessage calls the two overloaded methods that are the backbone to MessageManager. They both take the display name as a string. This is the name assigned to the MessageManager for any given display. This display is the name or ID of the display. This value is passed to MessageManager as the first part of the message to route the message to the appropriate display. Message is a string value that contains the message itself. We will show some real-world examples of this later. This can be any string, a message you write, game data, looked up value, essentially anything that you can save as a string. Color is optional. If you don't use color, MessageManager will use what was set as the default in the displays array. If you want to override that default color, you must send the optional color tag. The default color is set here in the displays array. There's a third important method included in MessageManager, and that's called clear messages. If for some reason it is necessary to clear any given list of messages, regardless of age, this is done by sending clear messages with the display name or ID of the display to clear. The most common uses for clear messages is either to clear a log, usually one saved in a scroll list, or to limit the display to only one message. We'll show this in more detail later on. That's all that needs to be done. Once everything is set up, simply send MessageManager.instance.message with your display and your message and optionally the color, or if you've cached a reference to MessageManager before, you can simply send to MessageManager.message with again your display name, message, and optionally your color. For a more in-depth look at MessageManager, you should move on to the setup video. In the setup video, we go ahead and set up MessageManager, clipping rects, and scroll lists.